Picture a corner storefront on a busy street in Jackson Heights, Queens. It is a Friday afternoon. The lunch rush is in full swing. The line of customers stretches out the front door and curves along the sidewalk. Inside, 14 people are moving with the kind of synchronized energy that only exists in a kitchen that has been running well for years. The smell coming through the open service window is the kind that makes strangers slow down as they walk past. The woman at the center of all of it is moving between the prep station and the pass with a quiet authority that her staff matches without being told. Her name is on the sign above the door. She built everything inside those walls with her own hands. And on that particular Friday afternoon, in April 2019, she had absolutely no idea that a man standing 40 feet away on the other side of a shared wall was holding a phone, about to make one call that would take all of it from her in 72 hours. This is the story of Rosa Mendez, and I promise you, what that man thought was an ending was only the beginning of what was coming for him. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let's get into it. Rosa Mendez was born in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, in 1978. She was the oldest of 5 children, and she grew up in a household that was full of love and permanently short on money. Her parents, Miguel and Carmen Mendez, made the decision in 1982 that many parents from the Dominican Republic made during that era. They would go to New York first, establish themselves, send money back, and bring the children over when the situation was stable enough to do it properly. Rosa was 4 years old when her parents left. Her grandmother, Abuela Carmen, raised all 5 children in Santo Domingo on the money that came in the mail every month, supplemented by the small garden she kept behind the house, and an iron-willed refusal to let any of her grandchildren feel the full weight of what was missing. Abuela Carmen cooked the way some people pray, deliberately, attentively, with the understanding that food was not just nourishment but communication. She taught Rosa everything she knew: how to build sofrito from scratch, how to time a slow braise, how to read a kitchen the way a conductor reads an orchestra. By the time Rosa was 8 years old, she was making the family's Sunday meals unsupervised. By 12, she was experimenting with her own variations. By 16, she had a clear and unshakable idea of what she wanted to do with her life. She wanted to cook professionally. She wanted to own a restaurant. She wanted to build something that had her name on it. Rosa arrived in New York in 1997 at age 19, reuniting with parents she had not lived with since she was a toddler, in a city that was overwhelming and loud, and cold in a way that Santo Domingo had never prepared her for. Her English was limited. Her culinary skills were exceptional. And her work ethic, shaped by watching Abuela Carmen stretch every dollar and every meal across 5 growing children, was the kind that employers in the restaurant industry recognize immediately and fight to keep. She started as a kitchen assistant at a diner in Jackson Heights, Queens, the neighborhood where her parents had settled, a dense and vibrant immigrant community that in the late 1990s was one of the most ethnically diverse square miles on the planet. She worked the breakfast and lunch shifts, studied English at a community center 3 evenings a week, and sent money back to Santo Domingo every single month without exception. Within 2 years, she had moved up to line cook. Within 3, she was managing prep for the entire kitchen. The owner of the diner, a Greek-American man named Stavros who had been in the restaurant business for 30 years, told her more than once that she had the instincts of someone who should have her own place. In 2001, she met Daniel Reyes at a church event in Jackson Heights. Daniel was a construction worker from her neighborhood, steady, warm, funny in the way that people who have worked hard their whole lives are often funny, with a dry humor that made Rosa laugh from the first conversation. They married in 2002. Marco was born later that year, Lucia in 2004, Elena in 2007. And for several years, the family operated as a unit in that way that young families in tight neighborhoods do. 2 people working constantly, children in the care of grandmothers and neighbors, and the loose community infrastructure that immigrant communities build out of necessity and mutual trust. Then in 2008, Daniel was injured on a job site. A scaffolding accident that left him with a fractured vertebra and an 8-month recovery ahead of him. Workers' compensation covered some of it, not enough. And during those 8 months, Rosa, who was working 2 kitchen jobs and managing 3 children and coordinating Daniel's medical appointments, kept the family in their apartment through sheer sustained effort. She did not complain. She made lists. She executed the lists. And when Daniel recovered and returned to work, something in the marriage had shifted in the way that things shift when one person has carried an unsustainable weight and the other person watched it happen and could not help. They separated in 2010, quietly and without drama, and established a shared custody arrangement that put the children first. Rosa, at 32, found herself starting over with 3 kids, a talent that had been serving other people's businesses for 13 years, and enough savings accumulated carefully, dollar by dollar, in the way women who grew up watching their grandmothers stretch every peso always save, to take a real risk. She decided it was time. In 2011, Rosa began renting commercial kitchen space in Astoria, Queens, 3 days a week. She took catering orders through word of mouth, starting with her church community, then spreading through the wider Jackson Heights network the way good food always spreads, which is to say fast and with strong opinions attached. Church events, birthday parties, a quinceañera for the daughter of a woman Rosa had gone to English class with a decade earlier. A retirement dinner for a longtime community figure that got her 3 new catering contracts the following week. By the end of 2011, she had more orders than her 3 kitchen days could accommodate. By 2012, she had enough to sign her first commercial lease, a corner storefront on a busy street in Jackson Heights. It was not glamorous when she found it. Previous tenant had left it in rough shape. The paint was peeling, and the ventilation needed work. Rosa and her 2 oldest children, Marco and Lucia, spent a full weekend painting it themselves. Lucia, who was 8 years old and had inherited some of her mother's instincts, added a small painted magnolia on the inside wall near the service window without being asked. Rosa left it there. It became, over the years, the thing that regular customers always pointed out to people visiting Rosa's kitchen for the first time. She named it Rosa's Kitchen. She opened the doors in September 2012 with 3 employees, a limited but perfectly executed menu, and a catering calendar that was already half full for the following 3 months. Within 18 months, she had a loyal daily customer base, a reputation in the Queens food community that extended well beyond Jackson Heights, and the kind of organic word of mouth that no marketing budget can manufacture. By 2015, she had 8 employees. By 2017, 11. By 2019, 7 years after she had painted that storefront herself, Rosa's Kitchen had 14 people on payroll, a 6-month wait list for catering contracts, and Rosa was in active negotiations with her landlord and a community development lender for a second location 4 blocks away. In the spring of 2019, a Queens community newspaper ran a half-page profile on Rosa with a photograph of her and her 3 children in the kitchen. The headline read, "From one bedroom to a borough institution." Lucia framed it and hung it on the wall near the magnolia. Gary Pruitt saw the article, and something in him that had been quietly building for years finally arrived at a decision. Gary Pruitt was 54 years old in 2019. He had owned the commercial property adjacent to Rosa's Kitchen since 2009, a space he operated as a deli and sandwich counter that served the immediate block with the kind of indifferent competence that keeps a business alive without ever making it meaningful. Gary had not built his business the way Rosa built hers. His father, a property developer who had accumulated several commercial holdings in Queens during the 1980s and 1990s, had left Gary a portfolio that gave him a foundation without requiring him to ever be truly excellent at anything. He had coasted on that foundation for 20 years, and he had watched, from 40 feet away through a shared wall, as a Dominican immigrant woman with no investors and no family money built something on the same street that he could not come close to replicating. The other business owners on the block had noticed Gary's attitude toward Rosa develop over the years. He had made comments about the smell of the food coming from Rosa's Kitchen, about the parking situation, about the noise during busy Friday evenings. Comments that the people who heard them understood immediately for what they were underneath the surface language. A Haitian-American dry cleaner named Patrick, who operated 2 doors down later, said in a formal statement that Gary had told him more than once that certain kinds of businesses were, in his exact words, changing the character of the block. Patrick said he had reported this to Rosa. Rosa had told him she was too busy building something to spend time on Gary Pruitt. That was the only miscalculation Rosa Mendez ever made in her professional life. Not because she was wrong to focus on her business, but because Gary Pruitt was not simply a resentful neighbor making unpleasant comments. He was a man who had decided that Rosa's corner belonged to him, and who had the particular confidence of someone who has never faced a meaningful consequence for anything. And in the spring of 2019, when he learned through his connections with the property management company that held both their leases that Rosa had applied for a small business expansion loan, a loan that, if approved, would fund the second location and effectively cement her position on that block for the foreseeable future, Gary Pruitt decided to act. What he had also learned, through those same property management connections, was something Rosa had been handling privately for several years: a documentation irregularity in her immigration paperwork. A gap that had resulted from a processing error during a visa renewal in 2014. A bureaucratic failure that had created a technical inconsistency in her status that Rosa had been working to correct with an immigration attorney since 2016. It was not a criminal matter. It was not fraud. It was a paperwork error of the kind that affects thousands of long-term residents every year and that immigration attorneys handle routinely. Rosa's attorney had told her it was correctable and that she was not at serious risk as long as the process continued moving forward. Gary Pruitt did not care about any of that context. He cared that there was a lever, and on a Thursday morning in April 2019, he pulled it. He called Immigration and Customs Enforcement. He gave them Rosa's full name, her business address, and her home address. He described her as operating a business without proper legal authorization. He did not mention the ongoing attorney process. He did not mention that the irregularity was a paperwork error under active correction. He gave them what he knew and let the system do what systems do when they receive a call with a name and an address and a flag. ICE agents arrived at Rosa's kitchen on a Friday afternoon, during the lunch rush, with 14 employees on the floor, a full dining room, and a line out the door. Rosa was taken in for questioning. Her documentation irregularity gave agents enough to initiate formal proceedings. Her work authorization was suspended pending review. She was issued a notice to appear and released. She was not immediately detained, but the damage to her business happened in the hours and days that followed, not in the moment of the agent's arrival. Word moved through the neighborhood with the speed that word always moves in a community where everyone has something to lose. 8 of her 14 employees, several of them in their own complicated immigration situations, left within 24 hours, not out of disloyalty, but out of fear that a business under ICE scrutiny would bring scrutiny to them as well. The remaining 6 held on for 2 weeks before the financial reality made it impossible to continue. The catering contracts were canceled. The loan application was withdrawn. The second location negotiation collapsed before it ever reached a final term sheet. The padlock went on the door on a Tuesday morning in May 2019. Lucia took the framed newspaper profile off the wall before they locked up for the last time. The magnolia stayed. Rosa's youngest daughter, Elena, was 11 years old when it happened. She asked her mother that night why they couldn't go to the restaurant anymore. Rosa told her they were taking a break. Elena nodded and went back to her homework. Children, when their parents hold themselves together with enough consistency, accept almost anything. Rosa waited until Elena was asleep before she let herself fully feel the weight of what had just happened. And then, after some time, she stopped feeling it. And she made a list. What Gary Pruitt did not understand, what people who make calls like his almost never understand, is that the communities they target do not forget. They have long memories, tight networks, and in many cases a sophisticated understanding of documentation and advocacy born from years of navigating systems that were not designed with them in mind. Within 48 hours of Rosa's kitchen closing, the story was moving through Jackson Heights with full names attached. people knew what had happened. People knew who had made the call. And while Rosa was working through the legal and immigration process with her attorney, her community was doing something Gary had not accounted for at all. They were building a record. The person who moved first and most systematically was a woman named Claudette Freeman. Claudette was 51 years old, a Black American community organizer who had lived in Jackson Heights for 2 decades and who had spent much of her professional life working on tenant rights and worker advocacy in immigrant communities across Queens. She had been a regular at Rosa's kitchen since the 2nd month it was open. She had watched it grow. And she understood, from her years of advocacy work, that the difference between an injustice that gets addressed and one that does not is almost always documentation. Claudette began collecting statements. From Patrick, the dry cleaner, who provided a written account of the comments Gary had made over the years. From the property manager, who had relayed those comments to Rosa and who was, by this point, deeply uncomfortable with what his connection to Gary's information network had contributed to. From 2 former employees of Gary's deli who had each witnessed conversations, specific, dateable conversations, in which Gary had made his intentions regarding Rosa's corner explicit. One of those former employees, a young man named Trevor who had worked Gary's counter for 8 months in 2018, said in his statement that Gary had told him directly that he planned to have that corner one way or another. Those were the words Trevor wrote down. One way or another. Claudette also connected Rosa with a new immigration attorney, a man named David Park, a Korean-American lawyer based in Flushing who had spent 15 years handling the exact category of documentation complexity Rosa was dealing with. David reviewed Rosa's full file within a week of being retained and confirmed what Rosa's previous attorney had told her. The irregularity was a processing error, it was correctable, and the process, while slow, was on the right track. He also noted something her previous attorney had not emphasized strongly enough: the circumstances of the ICE referral, specifically the fact that it had been made by a business competitor with documented history of racially motivated harassment, were potentially relevant to a civil action. Rosa heard that. She filed it in the list she was building, and then she went back to surviving. The period between May 2019 and early 2021 was the hardest stretch of Rosa Mendez's adult life. She worked from her apartment, consulting on catering events she could coordinate without a physical space, taking food prep shifts at a licensed shared kitchen in Astoria that a friend had connected her to. She homeschooled Elena through a semester when the family needed to keep a low profile. Marco, 17 at the time, took a part-time job at a grocery store without being asked and handed his mother his first paycheck without discussion. Lucia managed Rosa's social media accounts, posting recipes, updates, community messages, keeping Rosa's kitchen alive as a name, and a presence while the physical storefront sat dark with Gary Pruitt's deli operating 40 feet away on the same street. Gary had moved quickly, within 3 weeks of the padlock going on Rosa's door. He had approached her landlord about taking over the corner space. The landlord, to his credit, had declined, partly out of personal discomfort and partly because Rosa's lease still had time on it. But Gary had made clear that he wanted it. And the fact that he had begun making those calls within weeks of the ICE visit was a detail that Claudette Freeman added to her documentation file with a careful timestamp. In the fall of 2020, a journalist named Angela Booker entered the story. Angela was a Black American reporter at a Queens-based community publication who had written the original profile on Rosa in 2019, the one with the headline and the photograph that Lucia had framed. When she heard what had happened, Angela did what investigative journalists do. She started pulling the thread. She spent 3 months researching Gary Pruitt's history with businesses on and around the block. What she found was not an isolated incident. In 2011, Gary had filed a fabricated noise complaint against a Bangladeshi restaurant owner named Amir Hossein 2 blocks away. The city had eventually found the complaint to be without merit, but the process had triggered a temporary closure that cost Amir an estimated $60,000 in lost revenue and damaged his relationship with 2 key suppliers. In 2015, Gary had made an anonymous tip to the health department about a Jamaican bakery owned by a Black American woman named Shirley Thompson. The inspection had found nothing actionable, but Shirley said later in a statement that the reputational damage had affected her wholesale accounts for nearly 2 years. 3 businesses, 3 owners from communities of color, 3 calls made by the same man using the same methodology. Rosa was not the first. She was the most recent and the most severely harmed. But she was part of a pattern that, once documented and published, could not be explained away as coincidence. Angela Booker's investigation ran in the Queens community paper in late 2020. It was picked up by a larger New York outlet within 2 weeks. A national publication covering immigrant business communities ran a version of it the following month. The headline read, "One Queens businessman, 3 communities, 3 calls, a pattern nobody documented until now." Gary Pruitt did not respond to any of the requests for comment that Angela sent him. His deli continued operating. But the story was out, and 3 attorneys, including David Park, had begun a conversation about what a civil action would look like if the documentation was strong enough. It was strong enough. In January 2021, Rosa Mendez received formal written confirmation from United States Citizenship and Immigration Services that her documentation irregularity had been resolved. The processing error had been corrected. Her status was fully regularized. Her work authorization was reinstated. The thing that Gary Pruitt had used as a weapon, the paperwork gap, the bureaucratic error that had been working its way through the system for years, was officially closed. David Park called her with the news. She was in her apartment kitchen making dinner for Elena when the call came in. He told her it was done. She set down the spoon she was holding, stood very still for a moment, and said, "Okay, what's next?" What was next was a civil lawsuit filed in February 2021 in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York. The plaintiffs were Rosa Mendez, Shirley Thompson, and the family of Amir Hossain. Amir had passed away in late 2019, but his wife and adult son agreed to join the action as representatives of his estate. The defendant was Gary Pruitt, individually and through the property holding company that his father had left him. The claims included racially motivated interference with business operations, filing false and misleading reports with government agencies, and tortious interference. The legal term for deliberately and wrongfully disrupting another person's business relationships and contracts in a way that causes measurable financial harm. Claudette Freeman's documentation formed a substantial portion of the evidentiary foundation. Angela Booker's published investigation was entered into the record. Trevor's statement, one way or another, was included. Patrick the dry cleaner's written account was included. The property manager's statement, which had required a formal request to obtain, but which his attorney had ultimately advised him to provide, was included. And the forensic accountant that David Park retained spent 6 weeks calculating the cumulative financial damage to the 3 businesses. The total came to just over $1.4 million. Gary Pruitt's attorney filed a motion to dismiss in March 2021. It was denied. A second motion followed in May, also denied. Discovery proceeded through the summer and fall of 2021 and produced documents that significantly strengthened the plaintiff's case. Among them were text messages between Gary Pruitt and a business associate from 2018 that referred to Rosa's kitchen and to Rosa herself using language that required no interpretation. Comments about who belonged on the block. Comments about property values, a phrase with a specific and well-documented history in American real estate discrimination. Comments that, when read in sequence alongside Trevor's statement about one way or another, painted a picture of a man who had made a deliberate decision and carried it out deliberately. There was also an email, sent by Gary to his attorney in March 2019, 1 month before the ICE call, asking whether there were any legal complications with taking over a neighboring commercial lease if the current tenant were to, in his words, no longer be operating. The attorney had responded with a general overview of lease transfer processes. Gary had replied with a single line, "Good to know." The email was dated March 14, 2019. The ICE call was made April 11, 2019. The case went to mediation in early 2022. Gary's team made an opening offer. David Park's response, according to court documents that later became public record, was effectively a refusal. The case proceeded to trial in the fall of 2022. The jury was 7 women and 5 men, a cross-section of Queens that reflected the neighborhood Rosa had served for 7 years. They deliberated for 2 days. On a Thursday afternoon in October 2022, they returned a verdict finding Gary Pruitt liable on all counts. The damages awarded totaled $2.1 million. Rosa's individual portion, accounting for lost business revenue, lost catering contracts, legal costs, and damages for what the jury classified as emotional distress and community harm, was $890,000. Gary Pruitt's deli closed 6 weeks after the verdict. The property holding company that his father had built and that Gary had coasted on for 20 years filed for financial restructuring in early 2023. The corner space, Rosa's original corner, with the magnolia that Lucia had painted on the inside wall, came back onto the market in the fall of 2022 when Gary's lease restructuring forced him to surrender several of his commercial holdings. Rosa Mendez signed the new lease on that corner in November 2022. She signed it alone, in David Park's office, with Claudette Freeman sitting beside her. She used the same pen she had brought to every important meeting for the past 3 years, a simple ballpoint that Marco had given her when the civil case was filed, with a piece of tape on the side that said, in his handwriting, "Finish it, Mom." She finished it. Rosa's kitchen reopened on a Saturday morning in March 2023. The line began forming at 7 in the morning for a 10 o'clock opening. By 9, it stretched down the block and around the corner. Claudette Freeman was there in her good coat. Angela Booker was there with a notebook, working on a follow-up piece that would run the following week under the headline, "She's Back." Shirley Thompson drove over from her bakery in her van and brought 24 hard dough bread loaves as a gift. Amir Hossain's son came and stood near the door for a long time before going in, and Rosa embraced him when she saw him, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there was too much to say. Elena, 15 now and 4 inches taller than she had been when the padlock went on the door, stood behind the counter in an apron that she had embroidered herself with the word kitchen across the chest. Lucia managed the door with the focused efficiency of someone who had spent 3 years keeping her mother's name alive on social media and was not about to let the reopening go anything other than perfectly. Marco, 21 and home for the weekend from his 2nd year of community college, worked the prep station without being asked and spent most of the morning smiling at nothing in particular. The magnolia was still on the wall. It had been there through the padlock, through the empty months, through Gary Pruitt's deli operating 40 feet away, through everything. Lucia touched it on her way past the service window and did not say anything about it. She did not need to. Abuela Carmen, 83 years old and living with Rosa's parents in Washington Heights, watched the reopening on a video call that Lucia held up to the front window so she could see the line. She watched for several minutes without speaking. And then she said, in Spanish, "I always knew. From when she was 8 years old making sofrito by herself while I watched from the doorway. I always knew she would build something that lasted." What happened to Rosa Mendez is a story about the specific cruelty of using institutional power as a personal weapon. Gary Pruitt did not call ICE because he had a legitimate concern. He called because he had access to a lever and a willingness to pull it, and because he had calculated, correctly, in the short term, that the system he was activating would move faster than anything Rosa could do to stop it. He was right about the speed. He was wrong about the permanence. He thought 72 hours of damage was the end of the story. It was the beginning of the evidence trail. It is also a story about community, about what Claudette Freeman chose to do when she could have stayed out of it, about what Angela Booker chose to pursue when the story was uncomfortable and the subject did not want to be a story, about what Trevor chose to write in that statement knowing that Gary Pruitt might find out, about what Shirley Thompson and Amir Hossain's family chose to do when they were asked to put their names on a lawsuit and relive everything that had been done to them. None of those choices were easy. All of them were necessary. And without any one of them, the case that David Park built falls apart. And it is a story about what it costs a woman to lose what she built with her own hands and then rebuild it anyway. Not just financially, though the financial cost was real and it was brutal, and it landed on her children in ways that a settlement check cannot fully address. But the cost of the years, Of Marco's high school years marked by financial precarity. Of Elena asking why they couldn't go to the restaurant and being told they were taking a break. Of Lucia embroidering the word kitchen on her own apron, because that was the way she knew how to say, "I believe we are coming back." Those are the costs that do not appear in a court filing. Gary Pruitt made one phone call because he believed Rosa Mendez was someone who could be removed. He believed the system he activated would do permanently what he wanted done. He was wrong about her from the very beginning. She had always been the kind of woman who makes a list when everything falls apart and then works through the list until things are different. He had just never encountered anyone like that before. He had spent his whole professional life on the foundation his father left him, never having to be truly excellent at anything. Rosa Mendez had spent her whole professional life building foundations from scratch. When he took hers, she built another one. And this time she made sure it had his name on it too, in the court documents, in the published record, in the verdict that will follow Gary Pruitt's name in any search anyone ever does for the rest of his life. The corner is hers now. The sign still reads Rosa's Kitchen. The magnolia is still on the wall. And on a Saturday morning, the line still goes down the block. So let me ask you something before you go. If you had been Claudette Freeman, if you had watched this happen to your neighbor, to the woman whose restaurant your family had eaten at for years, to someone who had built something real from absolutely nothing, what would you have done? Would you have started collecting statements? Would you have known who to call? And here is the harder question. How many people right now are in the position Rosa was in during those 72 hours, with nobody starting a file on their behalf? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone today. Because stories like Rosa's only change things when enough people know them. And the Claudette Freemans of the world need to know that what they do matters. That showing up matters. That documentation matters. If you are new to this channel, welcome. We tell stories like this every single week. Real stories about real people, real betrayal, and the kind of justice that takes time but arrives fully when it comes. Subscribe so you never miss what is coming next. Because next week we are covering a story about a woman who discovered that her own brother had been quietly collecting their elderly mother's pension for 3 years without their mother's knowledge. And the way it came to light, in the middle of a family Sunday dinner with everyone at the table, is something you are not going to see coming. We will see you then.